There we go. Um, so I'll start things off with a bit of an update about Muskoka Conservancy and what we've been doing lately. And then I'll quickly go through some items, tools that you need or that are really helpful for identifying trees. Then we'll look at what to look for when identifying trees without leaves, specifically for our conifers, and then specifically for our deciduous trees. And then we'll go into the details for how to identify 20 common Muskoka species. Um, you guys should have all gotten a PDF of a key and guide to tree ID as well. So I'll go through how to use that towards the end of the presentation as well. Okay, so about Muskoka Conservancy, I know I recognize a lot of names, so you've probably heard this spiel a couple times, but I'll go through a bit of an update anyway. So Muskoka Conservancy is a registered charity, and we are the land trust of Muskoka. We were established in 1987, so we've been around for about 37 years, working to protect and conserve the nature of Muskoka. This is our main mission. And we do this by physically acquiring land that once acquired is held by us in trust and protected in perpetuity. So it's protected forever once it's conserved by the Conservancy. So how do we do this? So generally land is acquired through a generous community donation. Someone who would love to protect their land donates it to us. Occasionally, communities will raise funds for us to be able to purchase land as well. And in more recent years, there's been more grants, funding sources, foundations that are able to support us in purchasing land as well. So I'm very, very excited to say that as of 2024 and as of just this past weekend, we're now protecting 56 protected areas across the region of Muskoka. We've just gotten over 4,600 acres of protected land. So we're sitting at 4,619 now. Over 60,000 feet of sensitive shoreline on our major lakes like Lake Joseph and Lake Muskoka, as well as some of our smaller but equally significant lakes as well. And we're also protecting over 800 acres of wetland. So we are so happy to be able to protect these areas, to protect resources for the community, for future generations, but also to protect significant habitats and ecosystems that support at-risk species that are especially in decline. So as I mentioned, this past weekend, we just reached 56 properties, and it is the property you see pictured here. So this is our newest nature reserve, the Keweenaw Nature Reserve. It's protecting 17 acres in the Bala area. It provides wetland habitat, as you can see along the shoreline here, as well as forested areas, and just lots of amazing, significant areas for some species at risk. And we cannot thank Eleanor Keweenaw enough for her generous donation. So very, very exciting to be pushing forward our mission throughout 2024 already. I'll also mention that some of our properties are accessible to the public with trails and access points, but most are closed and specifically protected for nature conservation. We do have a map on our website where you can learn a bit more about which ones are accessible with trails, which ones are closed, which ones you can paddle around, and things like that. The last thing I'll mention here is that as a charity, we are a member-based organization as well. And we really can't do the work that we do without the support of our members, as well as an amazing, amazing group of volunteers who help us with a number of the activities that we have going on the land. So I'd just like to thank everyone who's involved with us, whether you're watching this presentation, coming out to volunteer, a member, whatnot. We can't thank you guys enough. So with all that being said, we'll move on to tree ID now. So to identify trees, you don't need a lot of equipment. You can do it without any of these things, but these are a few things that sort of can help you out a bit more. So you'll see I've got binoculars listed up here. So generally, if you think about using binoculars, it's for bird watching or looking at wildlife, things like that. But it's really helpful for tree ID, specifically when you're looking at a mature tree where all you can see is the bark in front of you and you're looking up into the canopy and it's hard to tell what the branches and leaves are doing up there. So using binoculars can get you a nice close-up look on the buds and the twigs and the leaves and things like that. So definitely recommend binoculars. We also have the opposite end of the scale as well, with a hand lens or a magnifying glass. So sometimes you're looking at a sapling, you've got the twigs right in front of you, and they might have a specific characteristic like hair that grows on the buds. And you want to use your hand lens to specifically look for that feature that you can really only see close up under magnification. The last thing I recommend is to have a field guide. So the one pictured here is Trees in Canada. This is the book that I used in school to help learn tree ID. Or you can use a key and a guide like the one I provided you guys. So we'll go, like I mentioned, we'll go through that towards the end of the presentation, how to use that as well. So really not too much involved, but there are some handy tools that can make it a bit easier for you guys. So now diving right into it, what should you be looking for coniferous trees? So the main two things for coniferous trees is you'll want to look at the bark and you'll want to look at the leaves. So when looking at the leaves, you'll want to consider the type of leaf, the shape of the leaf, and the arrangement. So when considering type, there's three options. They're either going to be a needle. So that's like when you think of the pines, which are needle shaped, as well as this is a fir here, the specific needles coming off, or scaled. So there's only one tree species in Muskoka that has scaled type leaves, and that's our cedar, which is pictured here, and we'll talk about more specifically soon. But with our scaled species, they sort of look like they have the scales of a snake or something like that. The sort of little sheets, little scales that are present and make the leaves pretty unique. In terms of the shape, they can be flat. So if you think of the fir that's pictured here, it's like the leaves have been sort of pressed between two books. There's no other shape to them. They're just flat. With our pines, they're considered to be conical or cone shaped because they're sort of all round around. The other option is square or triangular shaped. They sort of have some angles and edges to the leaves. And so that's what comes to mind when we look at our spruces. The last thing, oh, I'm getting some feedback from someone. If you guys don't mind muting, please. Okay, that's better. Thank you. Okay. Nope, it's loud.
Yeah, nice.
Okay, there we go. Sorry about that, guys. Okay, where was I? Arrangement. So the options for arrangement are going to be bundled or single. So bundled is when all of the leaves are coming from one singular spot. So when you think of our pines, they've got a bundle of a certain amount of leaves. Singled is when they're just singly coming off a branch or coming off a twig. So pretty straightforward for our leaves. These are all of the things that we'll be looking at for our specific species once we start going through those. There's going to be three options for bark in terms of texture. So it's either going to be furrowed or rough looking, like this example on the left. So you can see there's big chunks with furrows between ridges, just overall rough look to it. Smooth, like the middle picture here, where you're not going to see any ridges or furrows. This is a fir. You can see some sort of bumps on here, but overall it's got a general smooth appearance. Or scaly. So this is similar to rough, but it's almost got these sort of sheets or scaly plates on it. So it's not quite got deep furrows and ridges, but just sort of papery sheets, and that's scaly. You'll also want to consider color, but the color is generally going to be brown or gray. Sometimes there can be some undertones of pink or orange and things like that, but generally they're going to be a gray or brownish color. I'll just mention as well that bark may and will change throughout a tree's life. And so generally with younger trees, they'll have nice smooth bark, and as they get older, they'll get more furrowed and weathered. So for most of the examples that I'll show in the slides when we're looking at specific species today, we'll show the mature bark, because that's when it's going to be most important to be able to identify the bark. When the sort of leaves are high up or the buds are high up in the trees, and you can't see them as well, that's when you're really going to want to know a little bit more about the bark and what it looks like. So those are the sort of couple things that we'll go through for each of our species, and we'll jump right into it now. So our first species, probably the most common and well-known species for Muskoka, is our eastern white pine. So when you're looking at the leaves for this species, like I mentioned, they're considered a needle leaf. All of them will be considered needle leaves outside of our cedar, and they have that round cone shape. In terms of color, they're a light bluish green. So they're sort of the lightest colored leaf for a pine. Most of the other species will have a darker colored leaf. Their length is considered medium to long, ranging between 5 and 15 centimeters in length. And they're relatively flexible. So if you get your hands on some pine needles and you're able to really move them around and bend them, that is a key feature for the eastern white pine. For the arrangement, like all of our pines, they are bundled, but it's very helpful to count how many leaves are in a bundle. So for the white pine, there are 5 leaves found in their bundle. And the easiest way to remember that is to remember that the word white has 5 letters in it, and the white pine has 5 leaves in the bundle. So just remember white 5, needles 5 for white pine. In terms of the bark, it has a very rough bark in appearance with thick ridges and deep furrows, and it's got a gray color to it. So that is our first species we're looking at, white pine or Pinus strobus. So I've included the scientific name just for fun for each of the species. Don't worry, I won't test anyone at the end, but I'll try to mention them as we go through each of the species that we're going to look at today. So our next pine species is what I would say probably the second most common pine in Muskoka, our red pine. It's found more in areas that have been planted. When you think about like pine plantations, usually they're red pine. Needle, cone shape, same as all our pines. They do have more of a darker green appearance and color though, and they are generally considerably longer as well, ranging between 10 and 16 centimeters in length. And when you're considering the flexibility of red pine, they are quite brittle, and they do have a thicker, sort of more dense appearance as well. But if you were trying to bend a red pine, chances are it would snap when you're trying to flex it around. The arrangement, of course, is bundled, but you'll notice that it only has 2 leaves in a bundle, occasionally 3. So you guys remember, I just talked about it on the last slide, white 5, but red is 2 to 3, and red only has 3 letters in the word. In terms of the bark, it's got what's considered scaly bark, so those sort of little sheets and plates that appear, and it is overall a grayish brown color, but you sort of see a reddish pink undertone coming through as well. So that is a good key feature for red pine or Pinus resinosa. The last pine we'll look at today is Scots pine, which is actually an introduced species that is not actually native to the region or to Ontario or Canada. The main differences here is that the needles are very short compared to white pine and red pine, only 4 to 8 centimeters in length. They also have a very stiff and twisted appearance. So especially if you look at this branch here, you can see they're sort of all mangled and overlapping with each other. And you can sort of get that sense with the twistiness that's seen in the individual leaf here. They also have two in a bundle, but remember that they're going to be much shorter than the red pine. The bark is probably the easiest feature to help you identify a Scots pine. It's considered rough bark. It's got the deep ridges and furrows. But as you look up towards the canopy, I don't have it pictured here, but as you look up, you'll notice that the bark is sort of flaky and papery up towards the top. And it is a bright sort of reddish, pinkish orange color. It's quite orange. And you can sort of see the undertone in the bark here. But you're not sure what pine you're looking at, and you're looking at a mature one, and you look up and you see all this orange flaky bark, it's going to be a Scots pine or Pinus sylvestris. Next, we're moving on to our one scaled species. In terms of arrangement, it's also considered single and branching. So it's got sort of a leaf that will come off another stem singly, and then it'll start branching as well as it grows. The color is sort of a yellowish lime green color, although I've got a picture in the shade here, so it does look a bit darker. And the bark is quite unique for eastern white cedar as well. So it's a brownish gray, sort of got an orangey undertone as well, but it's got these long, narrow vertical strips that sometimes are a bit peely as well. So sort of everything about the eastern white cedar is quite unique. It's the only scaled tree or scaled leaf tree that you'll see, and it's got quite distinct bark as well. And so that is our Thuya occidentalis. Next, we'll be looking at all of our coniferous species that have single arrangements. So remember, that's when the leaves are just coming off singly from the branch. So the first two we'll look at, the one here is our eastern hemlock. Their needles are considered flat, so like they've been pressed down, there's no angles or other shape to them. For the eastern hemlock, they've got a pretty dark color of green, but they're also very shiny. They sort of have a glossy appearance to them. In terms of the size, they're also considered quite short, only 1 to 2 centimeters in length, and they're attached with a stalk. So it's kind of hard to tell, but there's sort of like a little additional piece of leaf that connects them to the branch or the twig that they're coming off of. In terms of the bark, they've got rough bark with ridges and furrows. But a sort of key feature, if you're really not sure if you're looking at a hemlock, is you can flick off a little piece of bark. And don't do this to every hemlock you see because it can damage them if it happens enough. But if you flick off a little piece, you'll notice this sort of nice purplish red, almost Merlot-like color underneath the bark. And that is a key feature for eastern hemlock or Tsuga canadensis. Next is the most look-alike species to eastern hemlock. This is our balsam fir. So it shares a lot of similar features. It has flat needles. They're dark green as well. But as you can see, they've got a much more dull appearance to them. They don't have that sort of bright, glossy color that the hemlock has. They are considered stalkless as well, or sessile is another word for it. So let me see if I can actually zoom in for you guys here. There we go. So if you look at the leaves, you'll see that there's no stalk that's attaching them to the branch, but the leaf sort of bends and directly connects them to the branch. And so that's what is meant by sessile or stalkless. They're also considered short, but they are noticeably longer than hemlock. If you're able to get them side by side, you can tell that balsam fir most often has longer leaves than the hemlock. I've also noted the smell here too. So balsam fir is well known for the nice Christmassy tree smell. So if you get a branch and you sort of rub it between your hands, you'll really get that scent coming through. In terms of bark, it's got quite unique bark as well. So it's our one conifer that's sort of considered to have smooth bark. It does have these resin blisters and raised areas that get full of sap in the springtime, but overall, it doesn't have those furrows or scales or sort of chunkiness to it. It's generally smooth. So like I mentioned, they've got the resin blisters. You'll see them full of sap in the springtime, and it is very satisfying to poke them, and the sap will come out. But if you do that, your hands will be sticky for the rest of the day. So only do that if you're okay with having sticky fingers. I've learned that lesson a few times. So that is our balsam fir, or Abies balsamea. Next is our white spruce. This is the only spruce we'll be covering today. So it's relatively similar to the hemlock and the fir as well. But the main difference is that the needle is not flat. It's got that square, angled, triangular-ish shape to it that allows you to roll it between your fingers. So if you pull off a single leaf, you can roll it, whereas with the fir and the hemlock, if you tried to do that, it would just sort of slide around, but it wouldn't roll. The color is green to bluish green. So especially with newer growth on the trees, they tend to have a bit of a bluish hue to them as well. They're also considered to be short, 1.5 to 2.2 centimeters. Arrangement, of course, is single again, but the majority of the leaves are found on top of the twig. So if you sort of looked at a branch head on, it would almost look like it's got like a head of hair on top of it, with all of the needles coming out. Whereas with the fir and the hemlock, the needles basically only come out like horizontal from the branch. They don't really come out at the top as well, like the spruces do. In terms of the bark, it's a brownish gray color, but has a bit of a pinkish undertone to it, and it's considered scaly with those little sort of sheets and pieces of scale found. So that is our Picea glauca. And now we'll move on to our last conifer, which is our leafless conifer in the wintertime. So I think I meant to mention this earlier on, but forgot, but don't worry, we're getting to it now. So our tamarack is our one coniferous species that will lose its leaves in the wintertime. So when you're looking at the leaves, they are completely absent in the winter. They leave behind these little stalks where they would normally attach to, and you will see the cones generally left behind as well. That will let you know that it is a conifer and not a member of a deciduous tree family. When you do see the leaves, though, they are considered needles, so they are not scaled like a cedar. They're considered flat, and they have a bluish green color to them, and they're also short. They are bundled like a pine, but they are more so considered as tufts. So they have numerous, 15 to 60, you won't be counting how many leaves are in these bundles coming out of a tuft. So it does have a very different appearance than our pines. And in terms of the bark, it's quite a grayish brown bark with more of a sort of chocolatey brown underbark if it does start peeling off, and it's considered scaly as well. And this is our Larix lyricina. So we've made it to the end of the conifers. If you have any questions about them so far, feel free to put that those questions in the chat, and we'll get to them towards the end. Now, moving on to our deciduous trees. So we'll look at a lot of similar features as we did with the conifers, but of course, our deciduous trees do not have leaves, so we'll also consider the buds as well. So when you first start looking at a deciduous tree, the first thing anyone will recommend you to look for is the arrangement, because this will really help to narrow it down to different specific species. So the arrangement can either be opposite. So this is an ash tree on the left, and you'll see the buds are directly opposite to each other. You can see these buds here as well are opposite to each other, or alternate. So that means the buds are coming off alternately on the twig. So there are two families of trees that have opposite arrangement in Muskoka, and they are the ash tree, the example here, and the maple tree. So by looking for opposite versus alternate first, you can really narrow it down. Are you looking at a maple or an ash, or are you looking at all the other options that are out there? We'll also consider the twigs and the buds. So you'll consider a lot of the same things for the twigs and the buds. The color, if there's markings on them. I've listed smell here as well, but there's really only one species where you'll look for smell, but I always like to mention it. And you'll consider the size, so whether they're considered like thin and slender, like this example here, or thick and stout. For the buds, you'll also consider shape. So generally, they can be long, narrow, oval, fit into one of those sort of categories. You'll also consider the color, size, and length. I've also got this diagram here just to point out some different features that you'll look for on a twig. I think what I'll be referring to most is the terminal bud. So that is the bud that is found at the end of a twig. And then the lateral buds, which are the ones that are found on the sides of the twigs. We'll also look at bark, which is going to be the exact same considerations as our coniferous trees. So we'll consider texture, whether it's smooth, furrowed, or scaly. And then you'll also look for color. Again, it's generally going to be gray or brown with some undertones or something like that. Okay, so with all of those pointed out, now we'll get into these specific species, starting with our opposite arrangement species, and starting with maples. So our sugar maple is the first one we'll look at here. So as I've already mentioned, opposite arrangement, which you can obviously see here, looks like these buds might have been nibbled on by a deer or some other kind of animal. When considering the buds and when looking at the terminal buds, they are quite pointed. So they've got a distinct sharp point to them compared to the red maple, which we'll look at next. The color for the buds and the twigs is relatively similar, especially with newer growth and younger growth on a tree. So the younger and newer the growth is, it's going to have more brightly colored characteristics to it. Whereas as it gets older and more weathered, it tends to just turn into a gray color. So the buds and twigs are a medium to dark brown. It's almost like a caramel or maple syrup color, if you will, sort of like a nice rich brown color. The twigs are also considered slender or thin. In terms of bark, for a few of our deciduous trees that we're going to look at, I'll point out the young bark and the old bark. For most young trees, they'll start out with smooth bark, and then as they get older, it'll get more furrowed. So the young bark of a sugar maple will be a simple, smooth gray, whereas as they get older, they are still gray, but they get sort of long vertical ridges and furrows, and a very, very rough looking appearance to them. So that is our Acer saccharum.
Did you check the machine for any message last night?
Oh, we've got another. I'll just mute that as well. Okay, so next is our red maple or silver maple. So you'll see I've got two species included on here because as when you're looking at these trees in the winter time, red maples and silver maples look pretty much identical. You can't really tell the difference between them. So of course, they've got opposite arrangement. When looking at the terminal bud compared to our sugar maple, it's quite rounded. It doesn't end in that sharp point. And it's also twice as long as it is wide. So they've got significantly longer terminal buds. New growth for the buds and the twigs is a nice, shiny, bright red color. getting sort of more gray as it gets older, as you can see down here. The twigs, again, are considered thin and slender, and the bark is quite similar to sugar maple as well. So it's got a gray color with sort of peeling sheets and yeah, rough appearance. So that's our red maple and silver maple, Acer rubrum, and Acer saccharinum. When you see them in the summertime, you're more well able to tell the difference between the two. Next, we're moving on to our ashes. So we've got white ash here, and our next one will be black ash. And these are the two species of ash that also have opposite arrangement and belong to that sort of grouping of opposite arrangement trees. But as you can see, the twigs are significantly more thick and stout compared to maples. So when you're looking at an opposite arrangement tree out in the field, one of the best next things to look at is whether the branches are very slender or if they've got a more stout appearance to them. And that way you can tell the difference between maples and ashes right off the get-go. So specifically for our white ash, looking at the terminal bud, it is wider than it is long. And looking at the lateral buds, specifically the two uppermost lateral buds, they are directly touching that terminal bud. And that's the key difference, one of the key differences between white ash and black ash, is those lateral buds are right up next to the terminal bud for white ash. They have a reddish brown color as well. In terms of color, newer growth will be shiny and have a purple to gray appearance. Bark is quite distinct for white ash as well. So the color is gray, but it's got these deep furrows that create really uniform and distinct diamond patterns in the bark. So the entire bark will be uniform with all of these little diamond shapes in them. And that is key to white ash. That's the only species you'll look at in the field that has diamonds in the bark. And that is our Fraxinus americana. Next is black ash. So looking at the main differences between black ash and white ash, the terminal bud is a bit longer, but it is still quite broad, and it does end in quite a point as well. As you can see, the two uppermost lateral buds are set down from that terminal bud, so they do not touch that terminal bud at all. And this is a really good example how there's many rules of thumbs in nature, but it doesn't always want to stick to those. So you might be looking at it and say, well, this is an opposite. You can tell that they're slightly off, but sometimes this does happen. But as you can see, it's not obviously alternating. They're still considered opposite. In terms of the color of the buds, they are a dark brown color. The twigs, again, thick and stout. Fresher growth is going to be a greenish color with purple sort of markings on it, but it's more of a dull gray as it gets older. The bark is quite distinct for black ash as well. It's got sort of a grayish brown color to it, but no obvious pattern. It just sort of looks like oatmeal that's been thrown on a tree. That's what they taught us in school when I was learning this, and it's stuck with me all these years. So just sort of very random appearance to it, but it is also extremely soft and corky. So if you were to press your fingernail into the bark, it would actually leave behind that indent of your fingernail. So it's quite soft and malleable compared to white ash, which is quite hard. For a few of the species we'll look at as well, I've also included an other category, and specifically for black ash, I'm pointing out their habitat. So black ash very much likes to have its feet wet. So it's often growing in wet areas like swamps and other lowland areas where it's a bit wet. So that is Fraxinus nigra. Next, we're looking and moving on to our birches. So we're looking at white birch first. And we're getting into our alternate arrangement. So for the buds of the white birch, they're considered to be slender and narrow. And especially with newer growth, they'll be greenish at the base and brown towards the tip. The twigs are considered quite slender and thin, and they do have sparse white resin glands that appear on the bark as well. That almost gives it like a pretzel look to it. And they are raised, so you can feel sort of the raises of the pretzel appearance as well. But generally, they're dark brown in color, and that is what the young bark will look like as well. So it's very dark, almost has a reddish hue to it, and it's very shiny as well. For the old bark, of course, I don't think I need to spend too much time on this because the bark of white birch is very, very characteristic. The only one you'll see out in the field like this with the big papery sheets that look like they're peeling off from the tree. So that is our Betula papyrifera. The second birch we'll look at is our yellow birch. So it has a lot of similar features. The buds and the twigs are slendered. The twigs have a sharp point to them, and they do have some hair on them when they're younger. So that's one of those instances where you might want to pull out a hand lens or a magnifying glass to get a look at those fine hairs. The main thing I'll point out for the twigs is that this is our one species that has a distinct smell. So again, don't do this to every yellow birch you see out in the field. But if you crack open, break, and sort of twist around the twig, it's got a very strong and distinct wintergreen smell and taste, apparently, but I have not tested that out. So it smells like wintergreen gum, which is pretty cool and very characteristic of only yellow birch. In terms of the bark, very similar to white birch in the terms that it is sort of papery and shedding off of the tree. But our yellow birch has a beautiful golden yellow appearance to it. And the sheets that are peeling are much thinner and more fine. So you can really tell the difference that way. And that is our Betula alleganiensis, a very fun one to say. Now we're moving on to our aspens or our poplars or populus family. So in terms of the buds for our trembling aspen that we'll look at first, they're considered quite cone shaped. So they've got a narrow pointed end to them and a wide base. And generally the tips and the buds are curling towards the twig. As you can see, this is from a pretty old poplar, and it's a bit gnarly, but it's the best example I could find. But you can still see those key features. The buds also have a very waxy appearance to them, and they're a nice dark reddish brown color. The twigs are considered slender, and they are also a shiny dark color as well. Specifically when they're newer growth. And now looking at the bark for our trembling aspen, if you're looking at the base of any poplar tree, it will be, or mature, I should say, mature poplar tree. It will have these deep furrows and rough appearance to it. But as you look up towards the crown of the tree, you'll notice it starts smoothing out. And this is very characteristic of the poplar family. So as you look up towards the top, it'll start smoothing out and it'll lose that furrowed, rough appearance. And specifically for our trembling aspen, it will have a whitish gray color that it transitions into. So sometimes it can even look like a birch tree with the bright white at the top of the tree. And so that is our Populus tremuloides. Next, looking at the large tooth aspen, the buds for the large tooth aspen are considered quite oval, so not as slender and pointed as the trembling aspen. And they do have fine white hairs on them as well, which you can see with your hand lens, but you can also see pretty well with the naked eye as well. The lateral buds found on the side are more slender than the terminal bud though. The twigs also considered thin and slender, a dull brownish gray color, but the new growth will have that fine hair on it as well. Looking at the bark, it'll have all those similar characteristics that I described for trembling aspen. But when you look up towards the top of a large tooth aspen, once it starts to smooth out, the color hues that are up there will be more of a orangish green yellow color. So it won't be a white gray like the trembling aspen, but it will have some more color once it smooths out towards the top. So that is our Populus grandidentata. Next is white elm. So the buds are pretty unique for this species. So they're quite narrow and oval shaped. The lateral buds you see, though, are pressed up directly against the twig. So they don't point out at any angles, they're directly pressed up against. When looking at the terminal bud at the end, it's what's called canted, which basically means it's at a 45-degree angle or point. In terms of color, reddish brown color, and sometimes it can have hairs on it as well. Twigs are obviously extremely slender, and they tend to be a grayish brown color. The bark, as you can see here, is considered rough. It's got some dark gray color to it and lots of furrows and fine ridges. And that's Ulmus americana, or white elm. Next here is American beech, or Fagus grandifolia. This one is pretty distinct and easy to pick out when you see it in the forest. When looking at the buds, they're the only one. This is the only one you'll see with buds like this that are very slender, long, and pointed. They do come out quite far from the twig as well, pointed out. And they've got this very obvious orange color to them. Similar to the twigs, which are considered thin or slender, and also have that nice orangey color. The bark is very distinct for American beech as well. It's the only species I can think of where the bark remains completely smooth and gray as a mature tree. Unfortunately, though, most of the beeches in Muskoka are affected by beech bark disease, which is an invasive species that will cause cankers to break out on the tree bark, which sort of removes the very obvious smooth appearance that they generally have. My other note for American beech is that they will hold their leaves over winter. So this is believed to help them sort of retain more nutrients and give them the capability to photosynthesize for a longer period of time. They'll hold on to their nice orange colored leaves, and you'll see those hanging off the trees. So that's our American beech. Next is ironwood. This is probably one of the trees with the most slenders, or most obviously slender twigs. And that's because their buds are wider than the twig itself, which is a unique feature for ironwood. The lateral buds do point out a bit from the twig as well. And the twig has a sort of very obvious zigzag appearance. So it's sort of hard right now looking at one single twig, but if you see one out in the field, you'll really see that the twig is zigzagging as it grows. In terms of color, reddish brown color. The bark is pretty distinct for ironwood as well. It sometimes is compared to cedar because it has these sort of long, narrow, vertical strips that are appearing in the bark. And that is Austria virginiana. Now we are moving on to our oaks, which are the last species that we'll look at. So first off, we're looking at red oak. They are considered to have thick or stout branches or twigs. And the key thing with their buds is that when looking at the terminal bud, you'll notice that they actually have quite a few. So they have very clustered terminal buds, and they're the only group that will have this. In terms of the shape for red oak, they're considered oval and pointed. So not very sharply pointed, but they do have that very pointed angle to them. In terms of color, reddish brown color. For their bark, they've got gray bark that is relatively smooth, but it's got these sort of narrow grooves that you'll see coming through that almost resemble splits in a hot dog. So if you're cooking a hot dog on the barbecue and you know how they get those splits that come through, that's almost what the bark appears like for red oak. For our oaks, they will sometimes hold their leaves during the winter, similar to American beech, but not as consistently as the beech does. So that is our red oak, Quercus rubra. Next, our last species is white oak, very, very similar to red oak. They've got the stout twigs, the clustered terminal buds, but the main difference is that the buds, although they are still oval in shape, they are very, very rounded. So they don't have that obvious point that red oak has. The bark is quite different as well. So it's a very pale gray, and it's considered to be scaly because it's got all of these little sheets that appear on the bark. So that brings us to the end of all of our deciduous trees that I'll go through. And now I will quickly go through how to use the key and guide. It's relatively straightforward. And then we see there's some notes in the chat. So we'll answer questions after this as well. So for using the key and guide, you'll start off with the key. It's sort of like a flow chart. So you'll start at the top where it says start. And the first question it asks you is whether you're looking at coniferous or deciduous. So basically, are there needles or are they just twigs and buds? And then you'll answer the questions as you go through and ultimately end up at one of these colored families. So let's say, for example, you're looking at a coniferous tree. So you move down here, scales or needles. Let's say it has needles. Are they bundled or single? Let's say they're bundled. You end up at pine, and it's got this sort of more light blue color. So then I've got the guide handily color coordinated. Let me zoom in a bit closer for you guys. So we ended at pine, and that's blue. So you find the pine category here. And we've got more specific information for the leaves, the bark, and then we have got some other notes as well. So once you narrow it down in the key, you'll see the more specific information in the guide, and you can narrow it down from a family group to the specific species. It's quite similar for the deciduous trees as well, but we've got some different categories. So we've got information on the twigs, information on the buds, information on the bark, and then other notes as well. So relatively straightforward. Hopefully everyone got that in their email yesterday. If you didn't, you can always reach out to me and I can send you another copy. And if you have any questions, you can let me know. And we're at the questions point now. So thank you guys so much for listening to the presentation. I know it's a lot of information getting thrown at you, but I hope it was a good start for learning how to identify some species. And I hope that you print off or bring out a copy of the key and guide with you to do some practice as well. I'll open the chat. There we go. So Lisa asked if any of the tree species I covered today are considered species at risk. That is correct. There is one species that I highlighted today that is listed as endangered, I think federally and provincially in Ontario, and that's black ash. So many of you have probably heard of the emerald ash borer, which has sort of been wreaking havoc on our ash trees. And so it has specifically caused the black ash to decline because it was a more specialized species in the first place that was found in less areas. It has specific requirements that it enjoys being in wet areas. So I believe this is the main cause for it becoming a species at risk, but it's the only one of the trees I cover today that is a listed species. That's a really great question, Lisa. And then Paul noted that Scots pine is considered an invasive species. Thank you for mentioning that. I meant to mention that when I was talking about Scots pine. It is an introduced species to the country, and it is an invasive species. So if you do have Scots pine growing on your land and you want to remove it, the Invasive Plant Council does have best management practices. It has a nice document that I think shows you how to identify it and the best ways to manage it if it is found on your land. So thank you for mentioning that, Paul. If you guys have any other questions, feel free to unmute yourselves as well or put them in the chat. I can hang around for a few more minutes. But if you don't have any other questions, feel free to go. And thank you for joining us today. Another one came in from Lisa. So she said, could you cover off in another video, recognizing disease on trees and threats to trees? That is a really, really great idea, and it would definitely be a whole other video. And I'm always looking for suggestions. So if there's anything that you guys are interested in learning more about, you can always send us a message. And we'd be happy to, either I can talk about it or we can find an expert to talk about a topic that you guys are most interested in. So I will note that interest, Lisa, and we'll see if we can get a speaker or I can do some more research into it. Yeah, and to get more citizen community science involved as well. Thank you guys so much. I hope everyone has a great day, and we'll see you at the next webinar. Thanks, everyone. Okay, bye everyone. Thanks for all the questions. We'll see you next time.